Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Gavin Bannerman from the original content team here in the John Oxley Library. I just like to welcome you all and thank you for coming along. And just also to let you know that if you're expecting Don Watson and Richard Allen to be speaking, we've had a change of plans, and very kindly, we've had Andrew Wilson and Andrew McNamara fill in at remarkably short notice. So we thank them very kindly for stepping up to the plate. For those of you who do know Don Watson, there was kind of an unexpected turn of events, but Don is in good health, if you know him, and we hope to see him back in the fellowship room soon here at State Library. His talk with Richard is being rescheduled to early next year if anybody is interested in catching up with that conversation. So stay tuned on our blog and through the usual channels for that listing. So thanks and have a good night.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Phil Brown. I was always meant to be here, and I am here. So thanks for coming this evening. And I'm the, if you don't know me, I'm the arts editor at News Queensland, and I also write for the magazine Brisbane News. And if any of you have read my column in there, you'll know much more about me than you should. And there is a vague relation to the subject later through that column, which I'll bring up. But thank you, and it's nice that these gentlemen have stepped into the breach later in the piece. And I know they've both had very busy days, and but this is kind of mellow in here, isn't it? So I think we can just relax and enjoy the evening. So we have, to my far left, Andrew Wilson, who's a lecturer at UQ School of Architecture. And it confused me at first because we've got another Andrew here, but it's not that confusing really because they're not the same Andrew. And this is Andrew McNamara, who's head of visual art, Professor Andrew McNamara, head of visual arts at QT Creative Industries, which sounds like a fun job. And so both of them, well, I'm into the visual arts, you see, I think, you know, it's better than working.
All the forms I have to fill in.
That's right. Yeah, that's the dramatic part of it, isn't it? Yeah. And both of them, of course, we're here tonight. The subject is Karl Langer. Now, many of you Langerites know about Langer, interested in Langer? Yes? People are nodding. Yes? Hand goes up. That's good. Now, I had heard of Langer, but I'm much more familiar with Gertrude Langer, the other half of the equation, who is a very influential figure in visual arts. And I don't know as much about her as I should, but I have a vague recollection of meeting her sometime many, many moons ago in her very latter years. A very interesting person. Now, they're an interesting couple, but Karl Langer is a fascinating individual, and the two Andrews have both, I hope you don't mind referring to you as the two Andrews, have both written about Langer, and some of that writing is in this wonderful publication, which you can grab later, which is about subtropical architecture, and which is partly what we're talking about. But we're all here, it's also, I guess, want to talk about Langer as a person and what shaped Langer, and there's an awful lot to talk about there because he's a very interesting individual who came here from Austria in the late 30s. So let's start with you, Andrew, on the left. What interests you about Langer? I mean, there's quite a big story there, isn't there?
Yes, well, I think he's an interesting character given his training in Vienna. He studied in Vienna. He studied architecture in Vienna, and he did a doctorate on concrete. So he's interested in concrete as a material. But he won a prize during his study for his quality of his drawing. So he, on the one hand, he was interested in modern materials, but on the other hand, he was a very skilled draftsperson.
A doctorate in concrete?
Yes, I've checked. Was interested in the topic that he did. So it was on concrete.
Not concrete poetry, but concrete.
Concrete, which would have been at the time very kind of modern material.
Yeah.
And then he worked for a lot of interesting architects in Vienna, particularly architects who worked on the superblock housing schemes in Vienna, which are kind of interesting projects that were supported by the socialist government.
So what years are we talking about here?
This was in the 20s and 30s, and he worked for other architects doing housing in Vienna, and then he ended up in the Baron's atelier in Vienna, and Oxley then fled the Nazi invasion of Austria with his wife Gertrude. They came through Greece to Sydney. They were in Sydney in 1938, and they moved to Brisbane in 1939.
It wasn't as much an invasion as other invasions, though, was it? Because a lot of the Austrians welcomed them.
Well, I think, certainly for Karl and Gertrude, Karl was shocked that basically he was fired because his wife was Jewish. So that was tremendous. I think he basically
it's hard
was
to imagine
traumatised by that.
how scary that must have been, really. But
for both of them, yes.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in Langer? When did you sort of first engage with the subject?
Well, in general terms, I think Queensland's been bad at giving an account of modern architecture. We're redressing that now, and we're running courses at the university that cover this period. But I think initially I was just interested that unlike other parts of Australia, we hadn't really covered the period that Langer's associated with. And he's an important figure, I think, also because he started to teach architecture at the University of Queensland. In fact, the first subject he taught was the garden design subject.
The what, sorry? The
garden design subject
right.
in the course, and that's partly because it was a small group of students, and he was welcomed by Professor Cummings or Robert Cummings and Bruce Lucas, who were the main teachers of architecture at the time, and they wanted to give him a position. So this subject was a subject that needed to be taught. So in fact, he's very influential in the kind of development of, I guess, what we would see as landscape architecture today. But at the time, it wasn't a discipline. It was taught within the architecture course, and so he went about researching landscape, and he was teaching initially landscape architecture at the University of Queensland, but he taught then design studios, and he was given the role of running a kind of town planning studio, which was a fourth year studio fairly quickly, and was influential again in that particular role, and also in the development of town planning as a discipline in Queensland and Australia.
Andrew, other Andrew, we were talking today, I think, about the boat people. And so they came here on a boat, and so we really benefit from people who over the decades who came here, particularly. I mean, some of the talent and that's come to the country, through circumstances abroad that are, dire circumstances. I mean, I guess if you look at a lot of our high achievers in Australia, they've come here as refugees, they've come here fleeing, and yet we're lucky to get people like that who come here, I guess, and are kind of like sort of germinate in the local kind of landscape, aren't we? To get, there's obviously other examples, but Langer's a very good example of that, I guess, and we were talking about that today. And when did he arrive? When did he actually arrive here?
Well, they arrived in 39. So
39,
in Sydney. It's interesting because she's an art historian, he's an architect, and the reason they go to Greece is under the story that she's going to do some art historical research, and then they just stay and apply for refugee status. So that's where it all begins, and you actually can see letters from her where she's sort of feeling already quite estranged, and will repeat themes. She'll say when she gets to Brisbane too that there's no cultural life, and I feel bereft and I feel isolated.
She wrote that from Brisbane?
Yes. Yeah. She and she wrote this in Greece too, that even in the time they were there, because you just don't arrive in Greece and everyone says, oh, that's good, you're a refugee, we'll take you. It's the same as today. It's a complicated business, but everyone was a boat person, whether you were illegal or refugee, or my parents were boat people from the 50s from Ireland. So we have this long history of it, and it's true that the complicated thing of the migrant story is that you bring something to the culture, but the culture sort of shocks you, and you have to adjust as well with what your precepts. And that was one of the things that Andrew and I were both interested in. The Sweat book was, just to plug it another time, is we were interested in that story about how this idea begins as the subtropical and when it develops. You know, we were looking at it in literature, and Courtney Pedersen's got a nice one just on fountains and water and. So, and across the visual arts, but architecture is a really interesting story because the architects really grabbed the subtropical as a theme, and Langer, I'm sure Andrew will talk about in a minute, begins to grab that theme himself. And it's not just a story of modern, but I think Andrew's right, modern architecture is not well told here, but what interested me in it was after they had a big show of architecture, saying that there's a very distinctive and interesting practices in Queensland at the Queensland Art Gallery, and there was all this fuss about it. Why would you have an architectural show in an art gallery? And I actually didn't have any problems with that, but what made me curious about it was the stories that architects tell about the subtropical. It either has this long continuous history from indigenous huts, or it has these series of breaks and nothing relates to anything else, and you make an argument for origins. So when we looked at it, we were looking at both these continuities and differences that make up the subtropical story. And Langer is part of that story because he actually wants to contribute to it, but he contributes it by bringing things from elsewhere, but also has to engage with what's here as well.
I guess one of the things is when you do come from elsewhere, sometimes you impose on the landscape. I mean, if you look at our architecture, obviously, originally we had English, it was imposed rather than even the clothing. I mean, if you see colonial people wearing ridiculously dressed up, totally inappropriate for the subtropical. So when Langer arrived, did he make was it a conscious kind of, was he very sort of consciously trying to adapt what he was doing to us, or was he, how did he, or was he imposing or did that sort of develop, how did he approach the climate and the new world that he was in his practice?
Well, I think partly, he was accepted and welcomed by the architectural community when they arrived. So I think both Gertrude and Karl were attending parties that Robert Cummings ran with students, and he was given this teaching position immediately.
Immediately, yeah.
They recognised that he would be a valuable contribution here, and he was very influential, particularly on Robert Froude and Campbell Scott, because when he was teaching a very small group of students. So he had an enormous influence on the first students that came in contact with him, partly because he had.
This is at UQ, yeah?
This is at UQ, but he also taught at the Tech as well. But they saw him as being valuable because he had that contact with the European modernism that certainly Cummings had been promoting since he'd been at the AA in the 20s and came back, and he took over the course at the Technical College and then moved over to run the architecture course at the University of Queensland. So all the material that he'd been talking about, Langer was able to give his personal account of, including colour used by Le Corbusier. So the students found him to be very inspirational, and he certainly was an important influence on the work of Robert Froude, who did Torbreck, the apartment block here, and also on Campbell Scott, who was one of the principals of Hayes and Scott.
One of the things that we're talking about Langer, and what you've tried to do is reclaim him, I guess, for present and the future. Architects are becoming more recognised, I suppose, along with chefs and others. So we have neglected architects in our sort of ongoing story. I mentioned chefs because 15, 20 years ago you didn't talk about chefs.
Chefs are more recognised than architects.
I guess they are. Spoken like an architect, I'm gathering, yeah. But
What architects on telly?
well, yes, there are a few. Yes, there are a few. So what I'm saying is, I guess that these people are part of the fabric of our culture, and yet, to a degree, they've been forgotten. I guess Langer's not as well known as he probably should be.
I think it's a little bit complicated. It's partly to do with a generational change. So I think the architects that worked immediately post-war into the 60s, there's a moment where the next generations kind of shunned their work. You know, they were shunning modernism. So I think in a way all that's happened really is that we've just lost that, lost some knowledge from that. So obviously we're trying to recuperate that knowledge. Architects like Robert Riddell have taken projects by Karl Langer and attempted to bring them back to life. And
Such as?
Well, he did a West Showroom, which is in the Valley, that was the office of Riddell Architects up until recently, but it's been refurbished, and so there's been attempts to...
In Wickham Street there?
Yes, in Wickham
Yes,
Street.
I've been to that. Is Rob still there? Or?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think he's here in the audience.
Oh, he's here in the audience, is he? Yes, yeah, I've been to those rooms.
But
Yes,
the
they're very
showroom,
nice rooms.
showroom's not here, but you know.
Robert is also now a sculptor, by the way,
Yeah.
if you've been to the Museum of Brisbane recently.
But yeah, so I think it's a kind of complicated story in relation to architecture, where I think we've just we lost sight of that work, and I think even in Australia and New Zealand, more quickly that work was recuperated. I think there was a bit more of a lag here for some reason. I can't really explain that, but I mean, I think Langer is certainly very important in terms of what he brought to architectural education, and the breadth of what he contributed in relation to town planning and landscape. Gertrude and Karl were involved in the setting up of the Australia Council. He was very interested in music, so they really brought a breadth of cultural awareness locally, which is not to say that obviously as he got older he would have become, you know, he would have been seen as being kind of interesting but a little bit out of touch. But certainly initially he was, I think, very
When
important
did he die?
locally.
68.
69.
Yeah. And
69.
So he died suddenly, yes.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact year.
Other Andrew?
Well, it raises a point that's worth mentioning about the Riddell architects reclaiming this. One of the problems is there are not many Langer buildings, so Queensland's been very bad at maintaining its architectural histories as well. So there's very few examples. You can go to Indooroopilly and
What do we have?
St Peter's Chapel.
So St Peter's Chapel, yeah.
The main roads building, which
yeah.
it was taken out of his hands, and it's about the government's, I think, in the process of selling the building. There's their own house.
Yes, the
is
house
still there.
exists.
It's still there? Where is it?
Indooroopilly.
Yeah.
St Lucia.
St Lucia. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Swan Road. Yeah. Yeah. I've seen the house.
You live too close to.
How does the house? How does the house address the subtropical? How does the residents address it?
Well, it's an interesting case because if you look at subtropical housing, the document that Langer produced, which is, the plans are beautifully drawn, and I think were very influential. If we look at the drawings here, I think we would see his influence in the way that plans were drawn and rendered by other architects. But initially, because of the moment when it was produced, he was taking advantage of Douglas Lee's research in the Department of Physiology. So Douglas Lee, his research was supported because it was about, he was looking at the tropics and the effect of tropics on people, and it was seen to be important for the war effort. So that research continued right through the war, and he was producing little papers for the university. So Karl actually appropriated the form of those papers and also had Lee's assistance. It comes out of a tropical housing committee that was formed for the state government. So out of that committee, in fact, Langer, what he did was he did plans for the tropics and subtropics, but he adjusted the title in line with Lee's research into the different climatic zones in Queensland. He identified 4 climatic zones for Queensland: the humid tropics, the arid tropics, the humid subtropics, and the arid subtropics.
Hot, bloody hot, very bloody hot.
And given that it was, he was pitching, I guess, for southeast Queensland, so he called the document Subtropical Housing, and he produced a plan for a community of 2,000 people, and also 5 plans out of 7 that he
Right.
produced for the Commonwealth government. He was pitching to the Commonwealth government to try and get work.
How far afield did his work go in Queensland?
Well, one of the things that I think of is what I was interested when I did articles. I was trying to figure out how architects explain this history, and going back to Langer, I think it's true. One of the key facts, well, both of them actually in different ways, but we can talk about Gertrude in a minute. But the contribution's still there. It's in the perpetuation of the ideas of subtropical thematic. I think you can see it as a history that people try to respond to the environment through architecture, thinking about materials and the whole notion of inside and outside and the permeability of that. But what happens, I think, is that Langer perpetuates those but does it in a completely different style. So it comes down, goes on the slab, it's on the ground. He doesn't like the Queenslander. One of the interesting things of that article is that heat is almost like a character. You know,
Sorry, this article is
the subtropical
housing
booklet,
paper that he wrote.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that I did cite an old document with.
I think it's here. Gavin
Yeah.
Gavin said that it was going to be available tonight for us.
Yeah, that's very much about.
There it is.
Aha. Yes. Great. Have a look at that afterwards.
So it's sort of very
Yeah.
technical in some ways, but you get the sense that we're walking up those stairs and it's so hot, and the house is so badly built that it's actually better to lay under a tree in the middle of the day, and that's cooler than one of the buildings we built. So he's fascinated with the whole same problem, but he wants to address it in different ways. So you see even things like open plan sections right in the middle of houses. So he changes the topography according. His big problem, isn't it, with the Queenslander, is that it works if it's facing northeast, but a lot of streets are not facing northeast, and therefore the wind doesn't go through it, and so you need to change the design of the house according to where it is, according to the street. So he's looking at sun, weather, and changes the topology according to that. And I think that's just re-engages the whole idea and gives it a whole new breath of fresh air, wouldn't you say? The subtropical thematics.
Yes, well, he's melding it with architectural science. So it's a kind of interesting document because it's a little bit schizophrenic. On the one hand, it's got these plans that he produced that are very much influenced by Neutra and Californian architects, Schindler, Neutra, that tradition out of Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, the plans, I think, are based on the Usonian house proposal by Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think I've looked at Karl Langer's writings, and I think in general he's agreeing with Lewis Mumford, who was a big champion of Frank Lloyd Wright. But in terms of climate then, he's in a way taking advantage of Lee's research into the tropics and this committee that was formed in Queensland to look at the issue of tropical housing. So I think actually the tone that he takes comes from Robert Cummings. Robert Cummings was the architect sitting on this tropical housing committee, and he had an experience working on Queensland house cottages when he as a draftsman. So he was very much tainted by that experience, and just the fact that you have, for example, a tin roof with no insulation is the kind of the charge that's used to sort of deem that the houses aren't, they're not acceptable, they're not modern enough. And I think really Langer's taking on board all of these attitudes that were present in Queensland at the time and taking them forward. And he actually, I think, introduces a more direct connection with international architectural discourse out of California and brings that into also a promotion of architectural science, which was like a new kind of area that was coming to the fore at the time.
I'm always interested in people as well as the subject, as well as architecture. I mean, I like to know about the person, and so the debate in that and art and everything. And some people look at the art, some people look at the personality. I'm interested to know what sort of a person Langer was, and what sort of a person Gertrude was. What do we, what do we know about them as individuals? What their temperament, how in your reading have you developed a picture of them, or
Do you think it?
Well, Robert might even be able to comment. I think he sat in some lectures of Karl Langer, but I think what I've heard is that he was a very gentle man. I think he saw education, the sort of bureaucratic aspect of education. He had problems with that. I've heard that he was very loath to fail anyone in architecture, and I've only heard good things about him, his personality. But and I think Gertrude is an interesting character. Andrew might be able to talk more about her.
I've heard different things. Like some people tell me, Langer was boring as a lecturer, and but I don't know. I didn't see any of his lectures. It's interesting. I have got a sense that there's a really good documentation about their first experiences, which are really interesting. Like and of course, when they arrive, World War II is declared virtually, so fairly soon after. So that creates all these difficulties for them because Australians didn't differentiate between refugees from Nazi Germany as compared to just Nazis. So they had that threat of being interned. Unfortunately, they weren't. They do feel culturally isolated. So Andrew's right. They do begin to quite actively get engaged at the same time. So Gertrude gives some of the first lectures in modern art and to a very influential group of people, the younger artist group, and they were sort of a breakaway from. Well, at first they were a younger version of the Academy, but they have a breakaway group. And
who would have been the artists of her era then? Who was anybody we know? Or
Lawrence Collinson's an interesting character. He was involved in art, and he also did poems, and he was the one who got the Angry Penguins into trouble by a few poems that were seen as licentious and talking about all sorts of naughty things, and Angry Penguins got into trouble, had to go to court for some of these things. And he actually was a very fascinating guy. He ended up moving to Melbourne, ended up getting into psychotherapy and then into law reform, but he was interested in theatre as well, so quite an interesting character. So there was a whole range of people that...
and she wrote. She was an art critic eventually, yeah?
From about the 50s right through... She dies in 84, so a lot longer but than Karl, but she outlives him for a long time. But she is very... one of the most continuous newspaper art critics in the country, which is really interesting because a couple of decades ago there was a book published on newspaper criticism in Australia, and it only had Sydney and Melbourne people, so she's not even in it, and she's the longest serving person. So there are all these sorts of complications there, but it is funny because they do feel a sense of isolation, but they actually get very involved early on, even when there's no institutions, and so they're involved in things like setting up a Queensland art gallery before there is one, or having a sort of there was sort of like a museum in waiting for a museum, really. But also the Australia Council, as Andrew mentioned, they were long-term supporters and active office bearers for it. So they're very active at the same time. And Karl, a bit like the Griffins early on, they're very pushes the whole idea that look at indigenous plants, and so they're quite influential in a lot of different areas. But it does come from that first period where there's this sense they arrive and there's this terrible period where they don't know what's going to happen to them, and they also don't know what's happened to their family back home. It's only about 47 that Gertrude finds out her mother died in Theresienstadt, which is one of the concentration camps. So, it's hard when you don't know what's happening to your family, but to wait 7 years is an incredibly long time to find out about these things. So,
do we have any sort of archival film of Langer or anything?
Well, he did. He was on an arts program on Channel 9, which I tried to find, but Channel 9 informed me they destroyed the tape. But I mean, back to, if I could just address the question of his teaching, I think one thing to consider is that he did teach for a long time in Queensland. So he ended up teaching, right up until he passed away. So for 24 years he was teaching. And he was only ever on 1-year contracts. So he ended up teaching at both institutions. And it's just partly initially he was on those contracts because the architecture faculty, as it was then, was very small, but he never became a permanent staff member. But also he was going all over Australia, working on town planning proposals. He was doing his work. So I'm sure that at a certain point in his teaching, he was relying on notes that he'd produced sort of quite a long time ago, and relying on anecdotes that he could tell. So, but I think initially he was very influential and was very close to the students. During the war, I mean, it's not really recognised that actually certainly in Brisbane, they kept the technical college open right through the war because the workshops were being used by the South West Pacific Command. Campbell Scott, for example, one of his students, was able to study right through the war, which is very unusual. He was at the technical college up until 43, I think, and the University of Queensland was only shut for the year of 1942, so he was able then to continue his study uninterrupted, and he had very close contact with the Langers because they lived in Toowong, so he lived nearby, and he was getting on very well with Karl and was invited to the house and had long conversations about architecture, and was very influenced, I think, by Karl Langer.
Did they have a family? Did they have children?
No, they didn't have children.
No, okay. So where was the technical college, by the way? That was...
Well, that's QUT.
QIT.
So it's on that site.
Yeah.
Because that was quite influential in the arts community. I mean, a lot of artists came through there.
Exactly. Well, that's in fact the architecture. When architecture was the architecture course was established, it benefited from the art curriculum, and a lot of the art curriculum was more or less taken with the building course, kind of combined to make the curriculum for the architecture course.
There's an increasing sort of accentuation, I think, in recent years on the relationship between art and architecture, and I don't know how many architects I know now who are also artists. There's quite a...
Yes.
So it's an interesting relationship between the two of them, sort of dovetails, doesn't it, in the sense that the disciplines that they're involved in.
Well, it comes down to the argument about whether architecture is an art or not, so that's part of it. But it's also, within the training, there's a long history of architects learning drawing or taking up painting or getting involved in the arts. Langer himself, as I said before, the prize that he won in Vienna was a drawing prize, and it was an art academy that he went to. So he's basically given the art prize by, even though he was an architecture student, by an arts academy.
Did they go back to Europe later? Or
they
did?
visited, But they ended up staying in the end, so, they sort of...
I think Langer was very interested in the United States. So he was friends with Victor Gruen, who's been immortalised by the television program, but he was he developed a kind of prototype for the idea of the shopping mall. Don't hold that against him, but...
I love a good mall.
It's not his fault that it's been debased, I think. But he had a lot of... I mean, there's a kind of interesting Austrian emigre diaspora of architects and artists that Langer was certainly in contact with. He was in contact with Ernst Plischke, who was in New Zealand, and corresponded with him, and obviously Neutra was an Austrian emigre architect. Rudolf Schindler was another Austrian emigre architect. Adolf Loos had a fascination with America, so there's a long kind of tradition in Austria, a kind of fascination with America or the New World that I think he also followed.
And there's quite a number of German Austrian refugees from even earlier than 1939, so throughout the interwar period, really.
So Schindler went to America very early. And
No, but I mean even in Australia, in Sydney, Melbourne and elsewhere, and there's a famous ship that comes out, the Danera, and they're all interned, and they're all refugees really too, but they're interned because they're Germans, and there's... famous scientists, there's Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, who worked at the Bauhaus, was there, and so some of them are people who really came and enriched the country in fact, this period.
There was another Jewish emigre German architect Heinz Jakobsen, he was initially in Western Australia, and he set up a practice there, but moved to Brisbane, and he was friends with the Langers and was involved in the setting up of the architects group, which was like a intergenerational architectural collaboration between.
It's like Freemasons or something, was it?
No, it's more. It's based on an idea Walter Gropius had at about the same time of a kind of a new way of practicing architecture. So, in fact, Robert Cummings joined, and there were the
Based
Vollers.
here?
It was based in Brisbane.
Yeah, okay.
The Voller brothers. One was a town planner. One was they weren't brothers. They were relatives. One was a town planner, and one was an architect. They were in this group, and they ran for about 5 years, and didn't get too much publicity, but they, I think, produced some interesting projects.
So, it's nice to hear stories like this, because it works against that idea that, Brisbane was invented in 1988, and it's all happened since then. But once you do dig back, we do have some, some interesting artists and people like the Langers who've been here, who are sort of layering down this sort of cultural heritage for us. And as you say, Langer's long teaching career, how many students would he have influenced? I mean, countless.
He was teaching across both schools, and I think an interesting aspect of architectural education in Queensland is that initially the technical college students and the University of Queensland students were together, because the University of Queensland was based adjacent to the technical college in Old Government House, but the architecture school was given some space in buildings in the tech, and so they were side by side, and there was a kind of distinction made at a certain point between the two cohorts, but essentially they were mixing together, and Langer was there at the moment, when they were kind of together. So he's kind of, had a very broad influence and ended up teaching in both institutions.
Did we say that Robert was taught by Langer? Was
I
that
think
wrong? No.
it was an anecdote, I think.
No?
No, he wasn't.
You met Langer? No, well then, forget about it then.
He's got nothing to say.
Oh, Gertie, yes, indeed.
I was taught by Langer.
Yeah.
You were?
Russell.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Was he a boring lecturer?
No, it wasn't.
No.
Your remark there is...
It wasn't my remark.
No,
I was
no,
told,
it was
and I won't even tell you who told me, actually, but it was someone who was also a
I
student.
don't know the remark, that is correct. I had him in town planning. I was in third year or what, but I must have been about 66 or something.
Okay.
67. And he always used to illustrate on the board drawings that he had drawn, which were all these pencil drawings, and maybe if there was something in Greece, it would be a beautiful sketch of these trees in pencil, which is from the epidioscope, so he put those up. But he certainly was a gentleman, and he took us for town planning and was always illustrating the negative and the positive side of, say, a European square. And the one that I can never forget, whereas he's relating where the cathedral is placed in a position where it's not just a vulgar avenue straight down to, say, the Arc de Triomphe or whatever. You go in this corner, you might catch a glimpse of this side, then you go a bit further, you see a bit that side, then you come around here and you see the full elevation of the cathedral. And his allegory was that you should plan something like this so the city is interesting. And then he went on to say, it's like going to a Marlene Dietrich concert. And then he said, Marlene Dietrich is renowned for her most beautiful legs. They can debate Betty Grable and Marlene Dietrich. I'll leave it to others. But and then he went on to explain, if you go to one of her concerts, you know she's got these beautiful legs, but she doesn't just show them all at once. You see a bit of ankle, you see a bit more, you see a knee, and as the show goes on, you see it all. And so he was trying to say, should a city reveal itself? Something like that.
I guess he was growing up in...
one thing.
Yeah.
I also attended as a student in a totally accidental fashion. I was at secondary school in Warwick. I don't know whether I got out of going to school. I don't know why I ended up there. I can't think at 15 why go to such an event other than escape school. But I went to this lecture on modern art by Karl Langer in the Warwick Town Hall.
Oh, right.
And,
There you go.
That's pretty memorable as well, in that she was out there trying to explain modern art to the citizens of Warwick.
I'm getting a mental picture there.
Yeah, it was more than a mental picture, it was slides as well. And one slide was definitely had this looking down at a scene on a river where you had all these reeds, like bulrushes that had fallen into the river, and you had green ones, the colour of the water, you had red ones, this, that and the other, and spots and dots of other things. And she put that slide up, and then she put some modernist artwork up to say, well, isn't this something similar to that?
There you go.
And that's my only experience of 30.
Yeah.
But it was interesting for a disinterested kid.
Yeah.
It was
So-
interesting, his architecture, that it does take into place town planning and landscape so easily a lot of the time. Because he had lots of plans, and there were some of these crazy ideas, like Queen Street Mall should be a pedestrian mall, things like that. And he also, Andrew was saying,
That was his idea?
he had this idea early on, and but there was another one. Do you remember when he was working for this, doing the works for Sydney? He talked about Bennelong Point, the tramways should be an opera house, and there were all these sorts of crazy ideas. So it was quite.
Well, he was working for, I think, Cumberland County Council, the precursor to Sydney City Council, and they were looking at sites for the opera house. I think he claimed to choose the site or point to the site as being.
Tell me...
and another one was that Brisbane should focus on the river rather than have its architecture.
Oh, that'll
turned
never
away from
work.
it. Yeah.
Tell me, I just want to talk about some of the structures, some of the buildings, and obviously a lot of them aren't there anymore. I mean, so I don't know if any of you are Gold Coasters. I grew up at Broadbeach, or around there in the 70s, and of course the Broadbeach Hotel, which was it Lennon's originally? It was.
Yes.
When I was a teenager, it was the Broadbeach International Hotel. But what are some of the actual things that we'd know from the landscape, or that people might remember? Or
Well, I think even the treatment of the ground plane, it comes back to this interest in landscape that he had. So he was looking at Californian landscape architects and Swedish landscape, and
in designing the Broadbeach.
in designing the hotel. So he put a lot of effort into the pool facilities, the public facilities at ground level, and was using circles and interesting patterns.
And we've got some great photos out
yes.
there to look at afterwards as well.
And so the building was kind of angled to its site in a very kind of modernist gesture. And I think
be the first high-rise on the Gold Coast? Or
yeah, so that area was actually a sand mine, so it was like reclaimed. That's one of the problems the Gold Coast has, is that a lot of the heaviness or the heavy metallic content of the sand has been taken out, which is why they have such a problem with erosion. But so that project was an attempt to reclaim that area, and I mean, it was a very successful project. I think he also worked with Indigenous artists across the border that he met, who erected some artworks outside one of the bars there, and so he was collaborating with
one of the bars?
Yes, so there were these sort of giant timber artworks that they produced. They may have also, I'm not sure about.
Where was this at?
This was at the Broadbeach Hotel outside.
Oh, right.
I found some evidence of
Good Lord.
just a reportage on his collaboration with these Aboriginal artists that
Right.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, so there was that aspect as well, but I mean it was I think the treatment of the ground plane is
Well,
very
you can
interesting.
see all that. There's some nice aerial sort of shots of the pool and the grounds and everything. So
Yes.
so it was. What other some other buildings around the place that are any still?
Well, I think it's interesting if we go back to what he was writing in Subtropical Housing. I think the work that he actually produced is counter to what he was arguing for in the document, which is kind of interesting. His own house, it sort of throws back to what he knew in Vienna. It's more like the houses that he might have worked on in Vienna, and so he he's sort of caught a little bit between embracing the modernism that he wants to embrace, which is this American work that he was interested in, but he's always returning, I think, to he liked Corb as well. So I think the main roads building is Corbusian in a lot of ways.
Is that largely as it was? I'm thinking. I know where it is.
Well, it's a compromised project. It was taken out of his hands at a certain point.
It was, yeah. And there are any other large buildings anywhere in Queensland?
He did the Lennon's Hotel in Toowoomba. I'm not sure if that's.
Oh, okay.
I think it's
Still there, yeah.
Yeah, it is still there.
That's a fantastic. There's fantastic images of that I've seen. I haven't actually been to have a look at it, even though my grandmother lived in Toowoomba.
Where was his? Where did it? Where
The
were
Chapel
his
of St
offices?
Peter's is a
Yeah, that's
Oh
a
yes,
great
of course.
example.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a.
Their own house is still there.
Yeah, the house.
But it was originally it was a pink colour, so he was advocating, based on some projects he'd seen by Le Corbusier, he was advocating a kind of all-over effect with colour.
Right.
So using unusual colours, not the green and red that you saw in Queensland houses, for example. So that I think, in fact, in this leaflet that's been produced for tonight, you can see the house on the cover of Australian House and Garden. So it's a pink.
Yes, it is
It's a pink colour with grey treatment of the window surrounds.
Interesting.
And so initially he did a number of houses at Narrowneck, at Southport. He did a house for Mrs. Jones, and that was a kind of mute plum colour.
Right.
And so a lot of his students were very interested in his use of colour and this sort of as an all-over effect.
There's a bit of Gold Coast stuff here. There's some canal estate plans.
Well, he was involved again. He was involved in early canal.
Where was it? Where was his office?
Spring Hill.
Oh, Spring Hill. Right. Okay. Yeah. We're coming towards the end of this part of the evening, but this is the point where we'll see if anybody's got any questions in the audience. Yes, one immediately.
Thanks. I guess you've been talking mostly about him as a teacher and an academic, and also, I guess, as a polemicist and a publicist and so forth. So he was pretty out there in that way. What about his practice? Was that influential because of the people who worked there? What was the scale of it at different times?
Well, it was small to begin with. I think Frank Salmon was one of his first employees. I think he worked. I'm doing research into Hayes and Scott at the moment, and I'm very focused on their work, and couldn't really speak authoritatively about how he ran his practice. But my sense is the way that he seems to have worked is very much as an independent figure who would obviously go to, say, Mackay, and he would negotiate with the council there for some kind of plan. He's obviously, because he was very adept at drawing, he was a very good draftsperson, he could knock up fantastic images. So I think he really worked out of that mode, and so he was juggling a little bit. He was trying to obviously make a living, and he had these. So just making the point in relation to teaching that he was never secure with the teaching. So he really had to be, had to find ways to procure work. And I think he's interesting in the way that he very quickly was working all over Australia. And I think that's very unusual for an architect. Normally architects tend to think of working out of their, or up until that point were working out of the town they were living in. But he seems to quickly move to a mode where he was, had this work in Sydney. He went to Western Australia and did some consultancy work there. He was very interested in the tropics, so he was, I think, moving around a lot. And because he was very adept as a draftsperson, he could obviously work up representations quickly. I think, obviously, when he was, I don't actually know how the Main Roads project was done, or how the Broadbeach Hotel was done, whether he had basically just expanded the office or had some kind of relationship with other people.
He must have had a good ongoing connection with Lennon's, because he did 3
yes,
hotels.
That's right. Yeah.
But I guess the other sort of buildings to mention that are are still standing. There's the sugar experiment station at, where is that? Is that Mackay?
Okay.
And there's a civic centre complex at Kingaroy.
Yes.
Yep.
Again, a bit mangled.
Yes.
We have
Yes,
another
that's
question over
exactly-
here, this gentleman.
Well, I have three questions, but
Three?
I'll ask only one at present. I won't hog the show. We all know that Brisbane in 1939 was a rather benighted place. I can't understand why they wouldn't have stayed in Sydney, ritzy Sydney or sophisticated Melbourne. Why did they come here?
There was work. Well, there was no work in Sydney when he got there. Originally, he was promised a job, but it didn't work out. So,
But they both seemed to be interested in the idea of the tropics. So
It's a bit exotic when you're from
Yeah.
Europe. Yeah.
you've
But
got,
he
to also remember during the war that there was the population, tripled, quadrupled, and they actually met quite a number of people. There was the Carnegie Foundation had an art library here, and that was very important too. So things about the war sort of became interesting, although it was tricky for them, as is mentioned. There was restrictions on them, and they weren't allowed to speak German, for instance. The only thing I've ever seen in a letter was she says something about Australian architecture, and it's in German. And she said there's no architecture worthy of the name. But you going back to your point, there was also controversy about that post, Andrew, that he got during the war, and they said, fancy an enemy alien getting this post rather than an Australian architect. And
so he was offered
strangely-
a town planning position. But,
yeah, but I wonder if strangely that made him, curiously after the war, well known.
Yeah, I'm
So that might explain why
Some
he was
controversy
getting,
about
yeah,
it,
the controversy
yeah.
sort of put his name forward in a way too.
well, even his work in Mackay was controversial, and he was looking around for a position, a permanent teaching position. So he was. I just don't think. Nothing worked out. But he was looking even in New Zealand and Sydney for anything that might be going. But he did profess an interest in the tropics.
Brisbane could have been a very interesting place during the war. I mean, it would have been pretty
During the
busy.
war,
You
yeah.
had, I don't know when MacArthur got here, but MacArthur was here at one stage. There was a pretty
Yeah, well,
lot of foment.
I think that's that's part of the reason it's sort of consolidated interest in American architecture. I think over nearly 1 million Allied service people came through the state in that period, so it really
Yeah, it
did
must have been quite
swell
extraordinary.
the population.
And a bit of trivia is this guy called Edgar Kaufman was here, positioned here, and he was the son of the family who commissioned Falling Waters by Frank Lloyd Wright, but also went on to become curator of design at the Museum of Modern Art. And so he was connected with Collinson and the Younger Writers Group, so he must have met Gertrude at least, because he was attending their meetings while he was here too. So the war froze up these strange
Yeah.
situations, like travel anyway, that you meet people, that you find people. So
I think there was a connection with Robert Cummings as well. With
Yes.
Kaufman.
Kaufman,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, Cummings was, I think, very generous to the Langers, and Karl Langer became good friends with John Moore, who's an architect and artist who was likewise a very good draftsperson, and produced a similar kind of book to Langer, and I think he would have met Moore through Cummings. Cummings was involved in Camouflage Committee, which brought together architects and artists from across Australia. So I think a lot of contacts that people made were through that. There was also in the 40s there was a committee formed to look at Brisbane after the war. They were concerned about sprawl and how to deal with that. So there was a committee formed looking at the appropriate kind of community forms that, and in fact that's where Langer's idea for a community of approximately 2,000 people comes from.
Where was this community to be? Do we
Well,
know?
he did a drawing that's quite abstract. It's not clear. It's like it's very kind of early 20th century German-speaking world plan, in effect, although it does draw on similar ideas that, again, Neutra had in the United States, with cul-de-sacs and what have you. But there
What
was
is
this
it,
idea
Springfield
of
or something?
there was an idea that an idea adopted in Australia pretty much everywhere about a kind of appropriate way to establish a suburb. So it was, the idea was to have a community centre and 4 or 5 groups of housing in sort of groups of about 2,000 people. So that
I guess he could have taken some of those ideas into these canal estate ideas to a certain degree
yes,
too, because
yes,
there's the cul-de-sacs and
yeah,
the sort of...
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny when I show this to students, that drawing, because, you know, Andrew's got a really nice piece about the cellular in architecture at that time, but you show it to students, they're completely amazed that something can be designed without having a road going through it, so there's no car accident. They sort of think, oh, that'd be crazy to get from this point to that point, you can't drive to it. But then when you tell them it's meant to be that in this community that you can walk any direction, 8 to 10 minutes is the longest you could be, and you've got a shopping centre, a park and everything in the middle, they're absolutely amazed because it's so far from our experience today. So this thing that looks a bit alien
It's
is
called a
actually,
village.
Yeah, yeah. It might be it's time to come back.
A rectangular village.
You could make hilly ones now, but you know, for Brisbane. But
Now, I'm
Well,
looking
that was
at
some
one-
of the criticism that it didn't seem to take
Yeah.
into account the topography.
I'm looking at my watch because I think we've come to the point where we're...
Questions? Go.
You are saying something now.
But having looked at the subtropical house, then the question that always comes up to me, it goes to whether you want to see it as precedent of the slab-on-ground house,
Yes.
which I personally view as tragic, and I also see it in reading as a hatchet job on the high-set house.
Yeah.
What do you think? Because I've just formed the opinion that the bit where the ventilation side of it, where a high-set house will get less ventilation, the distance apart, all the signs of that. On those low-set plans, you'll see the garage will be on the eastern side, not the southwestern corner, but the southeastern corner. And I think it was fairly purposeful to wide-ant a certain type of house and have a lot of disrespect for what was actually being built in Queensland. What's your
You know,
opinion?
I think that's true, and I think just the general argument really is
You've got one.
the general argument is the agreed position of the architectural community at the time, coming out of Robert Cummings working with Douglas Lee and in this subtropical housing committee. So I think it's critical of the Queensland House, but I think really those plans are based, I think, on Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian House, which is also a kind of prototype of slab on ground. So, but it's more about being on the ground. I know we can, and there was development after the war on soil cement slab as a new technology. So I don't think we can. I think it was an idea that was just an idea, exploring the idea of having a closer relationship to the ground and outside, which had been explored in California through Schindler, Frank Lloyd Wright, Neutra, even the case study houses. So just picking up that idea, and it's a bit of the plans. They're never built, so they are a polemical idea, and we can certainly. They are a kind of precursor to slab-on-ground houses, which I agree are problematic. But it's more exploring the idea, I think, of being on the ground then to have the potential to open up to the garden. So they criticise the Queensland House for being a platform, which takes a lot of energy to get up into, and then is divorced from the garden. So I think that's...
But I also think his argument that it depends on its orientation is quite a good one, actually.
Yeah.
So he's trying to get variable orientations, and I think if now with the standpoint of time, I think it's possible to see that the type of house is completely different, but the themes are very consistent. So that what makes subtropical architecture consistent is not the type of house, but the consistency of themes they're trying to address. So that, I find some of the arguments that there's a complete break and then there's something completely different. I don't think that's convincing. And I think the idea that there's this one long continuous history where it's always been Queensland art. It's also wrong. It's a much more complicated history, actually.
Yeah, I think because we do have a strong local idiom, it's obviously what happens is that people either swing in favour of it or they move
Swing
away from it,
against
but
it,
it's
yeah.
always there. So it's I've been reading a lot of different accounts by Walter Bunning, who grew up in Brisbane, and even Emil Soderstein, he grew up in Brisbane. They both wrote pieces about the Queensland House, so you can track whether people are kind of for the Queensland House or they want to depart from the Queensland House through through the discourse that architects wrote, and a lot of it was just through the newspaper, so it's quite easy to.
But and what I'm trying to say too is, if you close your eyes and don't even look at what they're talking about, you can see that the themes are fairly consistent, actually.
Yeah.
Now,
And you can see that all the way through to contemporary architecture.
it's just about time to put on our white gloves, and because that's a part of the evening that I know everybody's very keen on. So I don't know if you gentlemen are going to stay around and chat some more, hopefully,
Sure.
while we pore over the material that's available.
Well, I would recommend having a look at that subtropical housing paper and then looking at the other drawings by Langer and other architects with those drawings in mind, because they were done 43, 44, and I think they were quite influential on local architects as a kind of way of representing an architectural plan.
So
I must
there's
say
some-
one last thing. Andrew
Yes.
and I, we've got these from the IMA today. If you want to buy one,
Oh, indeed.
they're a special one-off price just for tonight of $10. So
Actually, I do
Andrew
also...
and I will be over there later.
And I also must mention that Karl Langer will be featured in Hot Modernism, which is an upcoming exhibition here at the State Library, and that exhibition opens on the 5th of July next year. So Langer will be included in that, so we'll look forward to that. But thank the two Andros for coming this evening. And thank you for coming, and please enjoy the rest of the experience.
My anecdote about being taught by Langer was Rex Addison, so I apologise to Robert
Okay.
for
Well, there we go.
conflating him with Rex
I do
Addison.
know that name, yes.